when the unemployment rate is low, historically speaking, if you look over very long periods of time, that means the economy is doing really well and everyone is, generally speaking, benefiting. Some groups more than others, of course, depending on the period, but that's usually what happens. But in the current situation, we have all this data that shows us that there are a whole bunch of people that are struggling. And when they just survey people and they ask people how they're doing, a lot of working class and lower income people say they're not doing very well at all, that things are getting bad, they're getting worse. Yet the unemployment rate is really low. And why is that?
Don't buy it. Bidenomics is for the rich, Democratic donors who are making tons of money off of Biden's, green energy boondoggles. We just saw another big giant, EV bus company went bankrupt, and wow, it sounds a lot like Solyndra under Obama. But these are the people that, are getting these hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies. These are the people that are reaping the rewards of Bidenomics. And meanwhile, just everyday working Americans are getting the shaft from Biden economics. And not to mention the fact that his wide open border is driving down wages for American citizens.
Yeah, I mean, I read through your piece. I don't know that it's published yet, so everyone that's listening to this podcast is getting a sneak peek about it. But there was some stats in there that I thought were super interesting. You mentioned some of this stuff, but 66% of Americans can't afford a $400 surprise expense. You mentioned the credit card debt surpassed $1 trillion, up $300 billion since Biden entered office. The alarming amount of people pulling money for like emergency reasons out of their 401ks. Like, it's just a litany of different like data points that you have in this op-ed. That's just like, I thought Bidenomics was crushing it. Why are all of these things happening?
And Kamala and Joe love to state that the unemployment rate is low, but that's such a meaningless metric. Because if you look at the labor force participation rate, and if you look at the number of Americans who are in the labor pool before the pandemic and where we are now, 2.5 years out of the pandemic, we are still down the total number of American people who are in the labor pool. And that's with 6 million new illegal immigrants who've entered the country.
Yeah, right. Justin, you wrote a piece published in Newsweek about the some alarming data as well in regards to the housing prices. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about what we're seeing right now is you have sort of a weird economic situation. We don't normally see the kinds of things that we're seeing currently, where you have really low unemployment rates mixed with all these other indicators that some of which Chris just talked about that seem to show that there are problems or economic problems. Usually when the unemployment rate is low, historically speaking, if you look over very long periods of time, that means the economy is doing really well and everyone is, generally speaking, benefiting. Some groups more than others, of course, depending on the period, but that's usually what happens. But in the current situation, we have all this data that shows us that there are a whole bunch of people that are struggling. And when they just survey people and they ask people how they're doing, a lot of working class and lower income people say they're not doing very well at all, that things are getting bad, they're getting worse. Yet the unemployment rate is really low. And why is that? Well, I think that there are a variety of reasons for it, but I think the biggest is that what is happening to the U.S. economy in the long term here is we are transitioning to a quasi-modern monetary theory model of economics, where the central bank and government print and distribute massive amounts of money. A lot of the economic growth, so-called growth, comes from government programs, some of which are necessary or are useful in some ways, and others, most of them are not. It's a lot of broken window fallacy type stuff where the government is, creating a program they don't really need, shutting down one industry and propping up another industry and doing things like that. And the massive amount of money printing that's going on does keep unemployment low. A lot of people leave the labor force, as Chris suggested, and just live off of the government. In other cases, there are jobs around because the government and central banks keep pumping money into the financial system so that corporations and others, especially big institutions and including government, has a lot of money to hire people. But real actual wealth doesn't increase, right? So you have sort of a relatively flat GDP growth rate. You have problems with lower income and middle income people being able to amass wealth. And that, I think, is what we're seeing. And I don't just mean in the Biden era. I mean, if you look really starting with Obama going forward, that really has been the model that has been developing. And under Biden, in the wake of COVID, it's been sort of supercharged. And if you look at Japan in particular, this is what's happened in Japan. Everybody knows, if you just Google Japan's economy and you just Google things about Japan's economy, you'll see that basically everyone agrees Japan's economy has been not very good for a long time. They have had very little GDP growth for like 30 years. Okay. They've called it they've had lost decades. They've had multiple lost decades, all kinds of problems in Japan, aging population, all sorts of issues related to that. But the unemployment rate in Japan has consistently been relatively low and stable. And that's because the government and central bank there prop it up by printing lots and lots and lots of money and keeping interest rates at basically zero or even less than zero. They have negative interest rates at times in Japan, okay? So that's how they do it. They flood the economy with money, and that causes all these distortions. People are actually not getting wealthier, the average person. Big institutions and banks and corporations and people like that, they continue to get wealthy. And some people, as a result of that, get wealthy. But most regular working class people do not get wealthy from that kind of a system, right? And so you start to see all these distortions that come into the economy that in a free market economy don't make any sense. Like having really low unemployment, but having no GDP growth. Like these things don't exactly make sense. But that's the kind of stuff that you see when you have trillions and trillions of dollars pumped into an economy. So in the United States, one of the biggest distortions that occurred over the past couple of years is in the housing market. When COVID happened, they lowered interest rates down to basically zero. And then the central bank, the Fed, did. And the government printed trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars and pumped it into the economy through stimulus programs and just sending checks to people in the mail, and doing all kinds of other things, COVID relief programs, etc., telling people that you can't go to work, so there's really no economic growth, but we're going to keep giving you money anyway, right? And during that period of time, in the midst of a total economic shutdown in the United States and in other places around the world, or near total shutdown, housing prices went up. They went up by a lot. And that makes no sense unless it's being driven entirely by distortions in the marketplace. So from 2021, a period of time in 2021, for 7 straight quarters, the housing price, the average price of a home in the United States, not a new home, but just any home in the United States, increased by 15% each quarter for, I think it was 7 consecutive quarters of growth. So housing prices were not just going up by a little bit. They were going up faster than it has ever happened before in history in the United States. Never happened before where you had that kind of consistent growth quarter after quarter after quarter in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, where you had people scared to go outside and actually spend their money. The cost of housing skyrocketed. Now, because of that, whenever you see this happen, historically speaking, and this is what the Newsweek article that Donnie was talking about earlier discusses that I wrote, whenever you see housing prices increase very rapidly in the U.S. economy, historically, almost always you have a crash, some kind of an economic crash, either the stock market or an economy-wide crash or a housing crash or a combination of those things that happens afterwards. And the reason for that is because housing prices shouldn't go up that fast. Okay. Now, they've never gone up as fast as what we just saw happen. So it's possible that we're going to see a crash unlike any crash we've ever seen happen. And we've started to see that in the housing market in particular. In the first quarter of 2023, the average cost of a house, sales price of a house, declined by more than 8%. Okay? More than 8%. That is the first time in the history of housing sales data that we have, which goes back to the early 1960s, that we had a single quarter decline top 8%. It's the fastest, steepest decline in housing prices ever in the history of the United States, worse than during the Great Recession. At the height of the Great Recession, I think it was about 7% was the worst single quarter drop. Then in the second quarter of 2023, it dropped a little bit more by another couple percentage points. So in just 2 quarters of the first part of 2023, housing prices dramatically declined. So after immediately skyrocketing for most of 2021, parts of 2020, almost all of 2021, into 2022, getting up to outrageous levels. We're talking about the average sales price of a home going up by $150,000 in 2 years. Okay? $150,000 in 2 years. We now see the steepest decline that we have ever seen in the history of the United States. These things only happen historically, according to data, okay, not my personal opinion, but these things only happen when A, you have massive amounts of distortion entered into an economy from the government and or central banks, usually a combination of the two, which is exactly what we saw. And almost always you have a gigantic, catastrophic economic decline that happens immediately after something like this occurs. And the scariest part of all of it is, as I've said repeatedly throughout this, we've never seen this steep of an increase in housing prices or this steep of a decline in housing prices in terms of the rapidness that this is occurring. So it doesn't mean that we're going to have like a Great Depression, Great Recession type thing that happens soon. It doesn't necessarily mean that, because we've never seen this kind of money printing before. We've never seen any of this. No one has ever done the things that we've been doing for the past several years, like shutting down the entire economy and all of that. We've never seen this stuff before, so we don't know for sure. But what we do know is, based on the data alone, it's looking really bad. And it surely isn't looking like this is like a golden era of economic prosperity. And I'll add just one last thing about the housing prices, because this is actually really important for people to keep in mind. The cost of buying a home is not just the price of the home. It's the price of the home, generally speaking, plus the mortgage rate that you pay, right? Because most people are not buying it in cash. So for regular people, the price of a home is the price that you pay, the sales price, plus the mortgage rate. Now, the mortgage rates are higher than they've been now in like 40 years. And the sales prices are higher, almost as high, if you obviously they just steeply declined, but they're still basically higher than they've ever been, other than just a couple of quarters ago. So the cost of buying a home right now is essentially the highest it's ever been, ever in history for regular people. So regular people can't buy a home, which means they can't build wealth, because that's the primary way that you build wealth. So regular people are struggling paycheck to paycheck, as Chris said before. They are having trouble putting food on the table. They can't afford a $400 emergency expense if it happened to them tomorrow. The price of groceries and gasoline is higher than it's ever been before. The cost of buying a home is higher than it's ever been. The cost of buying cars is almost as high as it's ever been. Roughly, it's in that period. The interest rates for everything is insane. The cost of having debt, which America is now addicted to, is higher than it's ever been before because of the interest, or higher than it's been in a long time. So these are not the conditions of a booming economy. These are the conditions of a declining economy.
Wait. Justin, do I need to play the Kamala Harris clip again? Because I don't think you understood. Maybe she didn't dumb it down enough for you, because Bidenomics is working. Do I need to play the clip?
And Kamala Harris is
right about everything.
Don't
trust your lying eyes. Don't trust your lying eyes. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
I mean, Jim, I was surprised when I first started to hear this narrative being spun that the economy is doing great. It's all doing fantastic. I mean, I look around and I see the high energy prices. I see the high gas prices, the high food prices every week when I go grocery shopping. And, the economy is doing great. I'm like, can you check again, please? Like, can I get a second opinion on this? What do you think about all this, Jim?
Well, I mean, Justin really laid it out well, and so did Chris. I mean, the idea, just politically, I mean, people feel the economy more than they look at numbers. I mean, people just get a sense of how things are going. I'm reminded of the 19, yeah, showing my age again, but I'm reminded of the 1992 election with Bill Clinton against incumbent George H.W. Bush. And the motto at the Clinton campaign headquarters was, famously articulated by James Carville, was, "It's the economy, stupid." And despite the fact that actually the numbers were actually showing that we were climbing out of a recession and we had economic growth and things were looking up, the media, by just parroting whatever Bill Clinton said, convinced voters that the economy was in bad shape, when in fact the economy was genuinely improving. And of course, throughout the 90s, the American economy did very well as we ramped up toward the digital economy and NASDAQ and all that stuff before the dot-com crash. What was it, 2000 or 2001? So people feel what the economy is more than they see it. But it does, the stories we have in the show notes today. 61% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, even as inflation cools, right? Because inflation is only 3%, I think was the stat in that story on, I think it was CNBC. Yeah, it's only 3%, and it used to be 7 or 8. And what was it? I mean, real inflation is actually is definitely in double digits and has been for the last year and a half, 2 years. And because people understand what it actually costs to live their lives compared to what it cost 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. People here in the chat have left comments saying that, yeah, I got a raise last year and it's all been gobbled all up by inflation. I mean, you need a raise of probably 8%, 10%. How many people get a 10% raise in their job? Not many.
Deal,
but
Jim.
that's
I'll
what you
take it.
need in order to actually feel more spending power, because inflation is just sucking all the value out of your dollar. People know that they're spending twice as much at the gas station as they did during the Trump administration. People know the cost of groceries have gone up dramatically. People know that when if they want to go out to eat or even just stop at McDonald's, that a combo meal, say number one or whatever, not that I would know exactly that a number one is a Big Mac meal for sure, and a number 3 is a double quarter pounder with cheese meal. I read that. I don't know that from personal experience, but that you're paying several dollars more for that meal today than you did a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. People know these things. And so it doesn't matter that Kamala Harris, who's never convincing when she speaks publicly, can say that Bidenomics is working. People know that it's not working. They can see it every day in their paychecks. They can see it every day when they go out to the grocery store. They see it every day when they go to get gasoline. And people are not going to buy it. It's going to be a really tough sell, I think, coming up into the presidential election.